Picture this. You've dedicated 23 years of your life to one person. You've taken bullets meant for them, spent Christmas mornings away from your own children to ensure their safety, and memorized every face in every crowd that might pose a threat. You know their coffee preference better than their spouse does, can predict their mood from the way they adjust their cufflinks, and have become invisible furniture in the most private moments of their life. Then, in 30 seconds of human error, it all crumbles. One mistake, one moment of letting your guard down, and suddenly, the person you've protected with your life is looking at you like you're the enemy. This is exactly what happened to Detective Inspector Marcus Whitfield on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in October 2019, when 23 years of unwavering service to the British royal family came crashing down because of a single, devastating lapse in judgment that would make headlines around the world and change the course of royal security forever. The morning started like any other in Marcus's meticulously ordered world. At precisely 5:47 a.m., his alarm clock cut through the darkness of his modest flat in Pimlico, though he'd already been awake for 13 minutes, as was his habit. The internal clock that had been calibrated by decades of military and police service never failed him. Coffee black. Toast. No water. Shower. 2 minutes of hot water, followed by 30 seconds of cold. The same routine that had prepared him for everything from state dinners with foreign dignitaries to emergency evacuations during terrorist threats. Marcus had been the Prince of Wales's personal protection officer longer than any other guard in royal history. He'd started as a young sergeant in the Metropolitan Police, fresh from a tour in Northern Ireland where he'd learned that survival meant seeing threats everywhere, even in the smile of a child. The Royalty Protection Unit had been a prestigious assignment back then, something that promised stability after years of dodging sniper bullets in Belfast. He never imagined it would consume his entire adult life. The prince, then, still married to Diana, had been a different man in those early days. Younger, more reckless, prone to sudden changes of plan that sent the security detail into quiet panic. Marcus remembered the first time they'd met, at a polo match in Windsor, where the prince had wandered off mid-game to chat with spectators, leaving Marcus to frantically scan the crowd for potential threats while trying to look casual. "You're new," the prince had said when Marcus finally caught up, his tone neither welcoming nor dismissive, just observational. "Yes, sir. Detective Sergeant Whitfield." "Well, Sergeant, try to keep up. I don't intend to slow down for anyone." That had been the beginning of their strange, unspoken partnership. Marcus learned to anticipate the prince's movements, to position himself like a shadow that never quite touched, but never strayed far. He became expert at reading the subtle signals. The way the prince's left hand would tap twice against his leg when he wanted to leave an event, the slight tilt of his head that meant he'd spotted someone he wanted to avoid, the particular set of his shoulders that indicated he was about to say something the press would have a field day with. Over the years, Marcus had evolved from protector to confidant to something that had no name in the official protocols. He'd been there during the divorce proceedings, standing silently in corners while lawyers argued and voices raised. He'd accompanied the prince on unofficial visits to Camilla's house in the early days when their relationship was still scandalous, ensuring discretion while the British tabloids hunted for any scrap of evidence. He'd watched the man's children grow up, had been present for private moments of joy and grief that the public would never see. The job had cost him his own marriage. Sarah had tried to understand. Initially, she'd been proud to tell her friends that her husband protected royalty, impressed by the occasional glimpse of palace life when Marcus would return home with stories he could tell and a dozen more he couldn't. But the missed dinners accumulated. The canceled holidays. The phone calls at midnight that sent him rushing out into the London night. The way he'd scan every restaurant they entered, cataloging exits and potential threats instead of focusing on their conversation. "You love them more than you love me," she'd said during their final argument, standing in their kitchen with divorce papers in her hands. Marcus had wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that love wasn't the right word? That it was something more complicated than love, more binding than duty? That after 15 years of keeping another person alive, they became part of your nervous system, their safety inseparable from your own breathing? The The divorce had been finalized on a Thursday. By Friday, Marcus was back at work, standing his usual position 3 feet behind and to the left of the prince during a ribbon-cutting ceremony in Cardiff. If the prince noticed anything different in his demeanor, he never mentioned it. That was their way. Professional distance, maintained even in proximity, emotions kept carefully separate from the job that required absolute focus. But this particular October morning felt different from the moment Marcus stepped out his flat. The air carried an edge of tension that he couldn't identify, the kind of atmospheric pressure change that preceded storms. London was waking up under a gray sky that promised rain, and the streets held that peculiar quiet that comes before chaos. The prince's schedule for the day was routine: a morning meeting with agricultural representatives at St. James's Palace, followed by a visit to a children's hospital in South London, then an evening reception for Commonwealth diplomats. Standard protection protocols were in place. Marcus had reviewed the routes the night before, confirmed security arrangements at each venue, and briefed the backup team on potential risk factors. Everything by the book, as it had been thousands of times before. At 8:15 a.m., Marcus arrived at St. James's Palace for the morning briefing. The security office buzzed with its usual controlled energy as officers reviewed intelligence reports and coordinated with local police units. Nothing unusual flagged. No credible threats. The prince's mood was described as cooperative by his private secretary, which in royal speak meant he was unlikely to deviate from the planned schedule or make spontaneous public appearances that would give the security team nightmares. Marcus collected his earpiece and radio, checked his weapon, and ran through his mental checklist one final time. 23 years of this routine had made it as natural as breathing. He knew every door, every corridor, every blind spot in the palace. He could navigate the building in complete darkness, and often joked that he knew where the light switches were better than some of the staff who'd worked there for decades. The prince appeared at exactly 9:30 a.m., as scheduled. He looked tired, Marcus noted automatically, probably up late reviewing briefing papers or dealing with family matters that wouldn't appear on any official calendar. There were slight shadows under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that suggested stress, but nothing that would affect the day's security arrangements. "Good morning, Marcus," the prince said as they walked toward the meeting room. It was one of the small courtesies that had developed over the years, an acknowledgement of Marcus's presence that went beyond the formal requirements of their relationship. "Good morning, sir. Beautiful day for October." "Indeed. Though I suspect you'd say that if it were snowing sideways." It was as close to banter as they ever got, these brief exchanges that humanized the strange intimacy of their professional relationship. Marcus took his position outside the meeting room doors, settling into the alert relaxation that would carry him through the next several hours. From this point, his world would narrow to a series of movements and positions, a choreographed dance of protection that had become as natural as walking. The agricultural meeting proceeded exactly as planned. 47 minutes of discussion about sustainable farming practices and rural development initiatives. Marcus monitored radio chatter, tracked the positions of other security personnel, and maintained visual contact with all entrances to the room. Standard procedure executed flawlessly. At 11:15 a.m., they departed for the children's hospital. The route took them through central London, a journey Marcus had made dozens of times with various members of the royal family. Traffic was typical for a Tuesday morning, nothing that would require route modifications or timing adjustments. The backup car maintained proper distance, and motorcycle outriders had cleared the planned path. The prince sat in his usual position in the back seat, reviewing briefing materials for the hospital visit. Marcus rode in the front passenger seat, eyes constantly moving between mirrors and windows, radio chatter providing a steady stream of updates from the security team. Everything proceeding according to protocol. It was at the hospital that Marcus first noticed something was off. Not with the security arrangements, which were textbook perfect, but with himself. A small thing, barely noticeable. His left hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his earpiece. A momentary dizziness when he turned his head too quickly. Nothing that would compromise his ability to do his job, just tiny physical irregularities that his hyper-aware mind cataloged and dismissed. The hospital visit went smoothly. The prince moved through the children's wards with practiced ease, stopping at bedsides to chat with young patients and their families. Marcus maintained his usual position, alert but unobtrusive, allowing the royal visit to feel spontaneous and warm while keeping every potential threat in his peripheral vision. It was a skill that had taken years to develop, this ability to be simultaneously invisible and omnipresent. But as they prepared to leave the hospital, something shifted in Marcus's internal landscape. A moment of disorientation as they walked through the corridor, a split second where he lost track of which direction they were heading. He recovered instantly, muscle memory guiding him to the correct position, but the lapse registered in his consciousness like a warning bell. 23 years of flawless service had conditioned Marcus to trust his instincts completely. When something felt wrong, it usually was wrong, even if the threat wasn't immediately visible. But this feeling was different. It wasn't external danger calling for his attention. It was something internal, something that had no place in his perfectly calibrated professional world. The afternoon reception at the Commonwealth Office was the final event of the day. By 4:30 p.m., they were en route back to St. James's Palace, London traffic heavy, but manageable. The prince seemed satisfied with how the day had gone, making casual conversation about the children they'd met at the hospital. Marcus responded appropriately while maintaining his security focus, but that strange internal tremor was growing stronger. They arrived at the palace as the October sun was beginning its early descent toward the horizon. Routine dictated that Marcus would escort the prince to his private office, conduct a final security sweep of the area, and then brief the evening shift before going off duty. It was a process he'd performed thousands of times, as automatic as signing his name. But as they walked through the familiar corridors of St. James's Palace, Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest. Not physical pain, exactly, but a loosening of some internal structure that had held firm for decades. The walls seemed to waver slightly at the edges of his vision, and the sound of their footsteps on the marble floors seemed to echo from very far away. He should have called for backup then. Should have immediately requested medical attention, or at least informed his supervisor that he was experiencing some kind of physiological distress. 23 years of training screamed at him to follow protocol, to prioritize the prince's safety over any personal discomfort. Instead, Marcus kept walking, kept performing his duties, kept maintaining the professional facade that had become indistinguishable from his identity. Because admitting weakness wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the unbroken record of service that defined his entire adult life, about the trust that had been built one perfect day at a time over more than 2 decades. As they reached the prince's office door, Marcus felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Not enough for anyone else to notice, just a subtle shift in the fundamental order of things that suggested something was about to go very, very wrong. He had no way of knowing that 30 seconds later, his life would change forever. The moment arrived without fanfare, as disasters often do. Marcus stood at his usual position beside the prince's office door, conducting his final security sweep of the day, when the first wave hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Not pain, exactly, but a complete dissolution of the boundaries that normally held his world together. The corridor stretched impossibly long in both directions, the familiar portraits on the walls becoming faces he didn't recognize, and the sound of his own breathing seemed to echo from somewhere outside his body. His vision tunneled, peripheral awareness collapsing to a single point of focus that kept shifting without his permission. The radio chatter in his earpiece became meaningless noise, voices speaking words in a language he'd forgotten how to understand. Most terrifying of all, he couldn't remember where he was or why it mattered that he stay alert. For the first time in 23 years of service, Marcus Whitfield lost complete situational awareness while on duty protecting the Prince of Wales. The medical term for what happened to Marcus was acute dissociative episode, triggered by a perfect storm of stress, sleep deprivation, and a minor stroke that wouldn't be diagnosed for several more hours. But, in the moment, standing in the corridor of St. James's Palace with the future King of England 15 feet away, Marcus experienced only the complete collapse of everything that had made him effective at his job. He tried to call out, to signal distress, but his voice seemed to belong to someone else. His hand moved toward his radio, but his fingers wouldn't obey the commands his brain was sending. For 47 seconds that felt like hours, Detective Inspector Marcus Whitfield was essentially unconscious while still standing upright, his body maintaining the appearance of alertness while his mind temporarily ceased to function. During those 47 seconds, several things happened in sequence that would later be dissected by internal investigators, analyzed by security experts, and debated in parliamentary committees on royal protection protocols. First, a delivery van that had been cleared through 3 separate security checkpoints earlier that morning pulled into the service courtyard behind St. James's Palace. The driver, a 34-year-old man named Ahmed Hassan, who had been delivering catering supplies to royal residences for 6 years without incident, was running 40 minutes behind schedule due to traffic delays. The van contained exactly what the manifest indicated: fresh flowers for the evening's Commonwealth reception, premium catering supplies, and several cases of wine that had been specifically requested for the diplomatic gathering. Second, a new member of the palace security staff, Officer Janet Morrison, was monitoring the service entrance for her first week on royal protection duty. Morrison had been transferred from the diplomatic protection unit, where protocols were different and the pace less demanding than palace security. She'd been specifically instructed to verify all deliveries against a master list and to ensure that no vehicles remained in the courtyard longer than necessary. Third, the prince decided to take an unscheduled walk to clear his head after a particularly frustrating phone conversation with his press secretary about negative coverage in the morning papers. This wasn't unusual. The prince often took spontaneous strolls through the palace when he needed to think, and the security team had protocols for such movements. But these protocols required constant communication between his personal protection officer and the Palace Security Command Center. Marcus, in his dissociated state, was unable to process or respond to the prince's movement. The prince opened his office door and stepped into the corridor, expecting to find Marcus at his usual position. Instead, he found his protection officer standing perfectly still, eyes open but unfocused, apparently staring at something no one else could see. The prince had seen enough of human behavior over 5 decades of public life to recognize that something was seriously wrong. "Marcus," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm anyone else who might be in the corridor. "Are you all right?" No response. Marcus continued staring straight ahead, his breathing shallow and rapid, small tremors running through his hands that he seemed unaware of. To the prince, it looked like his most trusted guard was having some kind of breakdown at the worst possible moment. Protocol dictated that the prince should immediately summon backup security and remain in his office until the situation was resolved. Instead, he made a decision that would later be criticized by security experts and defended by those who understood the complex relationship between the royal family and their protection officers. He stepped closer to Marcus, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and spoke in the tone he might use with a spooked horse. "Marcus, I need you to focus on my voice. You're at St. James's Palace. It's Tuesday afternoon. You're safe, and so am I." The touch and familiar voice began to penetrate the fog surrounding Marcus's consciousness. He blinked several times, his vision gradually clearing, the corridor slowly returning to its normal dimensions. But the process of regaining awareness was slow and incomplete. He could see the prince standing beside him, could understand that he was supposed to be protecting this person, but couldn't quite remember how or from what. "Sir," Marcus's voice came out as barely a whisper. "There you are," the prince said with evident relief. "You gave me quite a scare. Are you feeling unwell?" Marcus tried to respond, tried to assure his charge that everything was fine and under control, but the words wouldn't form properly. His training screamed at him to maintain professional composure, but his brain felt like it was operating through several inches of thick glass. He managed to nod, hoping to convey that he was recovering, that he could still do his job. It was at this moment that Officer Morrison's voice crackled through the palace communication system. "Command, we have an unscheduled delivery vehicle that's been in the service courtyard for 43 minutes. Driver claims he was delayed by traffic, but he's asking for access to the main building to complete his delivery. Request guidance on protocol." Under normal circumstances, this would have been a routine communication that Marcus would have monitored and responded to if necessary. The delivery had been pre-approved, the driver was known to palace security, and the delay was well within acceptable parameters. But in his compromised state, Marcus heard the radio chatter as a threat assessment that he couldn't properly process. His fragmented consciousness fixated on the word unscheduled and the fact that someone was requesting access to the main building. Without fully understanding what he was responding to, Marcus's body shifted into high alert mode. His hand moved to his weapon, his stance changed to a defensive position, and he stepped between the prince and the direction of the service courtyard, despite being inside the palace with several walls and corridors between them and the delivery area. "What's wrong?" the prince asked, immediately picking up on Marcus's change in demeanor. "Sir, we need to move you to a secure location immediately," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his mental confusion. "There's a potential threat in the building." This was where 23 years of flawless service worked against Marcus rather than for him. The prince had learned to trust his protection officers' threat assessments completely. When Marcus said there was danger, there was danger. When Marcus said they needed to move, they moved. The prince had never known Marcus to be wrong about security matters, had never seen him react to false alarms or phantom threats. So when Marcus grabbed the prince's arm and began guiding him rapidly down the corridor toward the secure area of the palace, the prince didn't question the urgency. He trusted his protector's judgment even when he couldn't understand what had triggered the alert. "What kind of threat?" the prince asked as they walked quickly through corridors that Marcus now perceived as potentially hostile territory. "Unscheduled access attempt," Marcus replied, the fragments of radio chatter he'd heard reorganizing themselves into what seemed like a coherent threat narrative. "Unknown individual seeking entry to main building. Potential security breach." They moved through the palace at a pace that drew attention from staff members and other security personnel. Marcus's radio was buzzing with confused communications from the command center, trying to understand why the prince was being moved to a secure location without any threat having been identified or confirmed. "Whitfield, report your status," came the voice of Chief Inspector Davidson, Marcus's supervisor. "We show no active threats on any channel. Please confirm your situation." Marcus tried to respond, but the words came out in a jumbled sequence that made little sense even to him. "Confirming movement to secure. Unscheduled delivery. Potential access breach. Print secure and mobile. Whitfield, slow down and repeat. We're not tracking any delivery issues. Morrison reports routine catering supplies in the service area. Please clarify your threat assessment." But Marcus was no longer capable of clarifying anything. His brain was operating on pure instinct and training, processing partial information and filling in the gaps with assumptions that seemed logical in his compromised state. The more questions came through his radio, the more convinced he became that there was some kind of coordinated security breach that others weren't seeing. By the time they reached the secure wing of the palace, Marcus was in full crisis response mode. He positioned the prince in the reinforced safe room that was designated for high-threat situations, activated the electronic locks, and began implementing evacuation protocols that were designed for terrorist attacks or attempted assassinations. "Marcus," the prince said, his voice carrying a note of authority that had been honed by decades of command experience, "I need you to stop for a moment and explain to me exactly what you think is happening." It was a reasonable request, but Marcus couldn't provide a reasonable answer. In his mind, fragments of information were connecting into a pattern that felt urgent and dangerous. Unscheduled delivery, unknown access request, communication difficulties with command center, questions about his threat assessment that suggested others might be compromised. To his damaged consciousness, it looked like a systematic failure of palace security that required immediate and dramatic response. "Sir, I believe we may be dealing with a coordinated breach. Multiple access attempts, communication interference, possible insider compromise. Standard protocol requires complete lockdown until the situation can be assessed. The prince studied Marcus's face, noting the dilated pupils, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his responses seemed slightly disconnected from the questions being asked. Something was clearly wrong with his protection officer, but the wrongness didn't necessarily mean his threat assessment was incorrect. Royal family members learn early to distinguish between personal problems and professional judgment, to trust the expertise of their security teams even when they don't understand the reasoning. The safe room was designed to sustain occupancy for several hours if necessary. It had independent communication systems, emergency supplies, and reinforced construction that could withstand significant explosive force. Marcus activated all security systems and began implementing procedures that hadn't been used since the early days of the Troubles, when threats against the royal family were more frequent and more credible. Outside the safe room, St. James's Palace erupted into controlled chaos. The sudden lockdown triggered automatic alerts to multiple law enforcement agencies. Armed police units were dispatched to the palace perimeter. Intelligence services began emergency assessments of current threat levels. Government security officials were notified that the Prince of Wales had been moved to a secure location due to an unspecified threat. Chief Inspector Davidson arrived at the palace within 7 minutes, trying to piece together what had triggered the most significant security alert in recent memory. Officer Morrison was questioned about the delivery that had apparently initiated the crisis. The catering van was searched from top to bottom, its driver detained for questioning, every item on the manifest examined by explosives experts. They found nothing. No weapons, no suspicious materials, no evidence of any threat whatsoever. Ahmed Hassan, the delivery driver, had been delayed by traffic exactly as he'd reported. His background check was clean, his delivery manifest matched perfectly with palace records, and he appeared genuinely bewildered by the sudden swarm of armed police officers examining his cargo of flowers and wine. Inside the safe room, Marcus was beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong, though not in the way he'd initially thought. His mental clarity was slowly returning, and with it came the horrifying awareness that he might have just made the most catastrophic mistake of his professional life. The prince sat calmly in the reinforced chair, watching Marcus with a mixture of concern and careful assessment. "How long have we been in here?" the prince asked quietly. Marcus checked his watch, a simple action that required tremendous concentration. 14 minutes, sir. And in 14 minutes, what additional information have you received about this threat you identified? Marcus began, then stopped. He tried to remember exactly what had triggered his response. What specific intelligence had convinced him that the prince was in immediate danger? The details that had seemed so clear and urgent 40 minutes ago were now fragmenting, dissolving into incoherent pieces that didn't form any recognizable pattern. "Sir, I think—" Marcus's voice trailed off as the full magnitude of what he'd done began to register. He'd locked down one of Britain's most important royal residences, deployed multiple armed response units, and triggered security alerts that would reach the highest levels of government. All because he'd misinterpreted routine radio chatter while experiencing some kind of medical episode that he still didn't understand. "You think what, Marcus?" "I think I may have made an error in judgment." The prince nodded slowly. "I was beginning to suspect as much. The question now is what we do about it." Outside the safe room, the investigation was reaching its inevitable conclusion. No threat had been identified. No security breach had occurred. The catering delivery that had apparently triggered the alert was completely routine. Chief Inspector Davidson was facing the uncomfortable reality that his most experienced protection officer had just created an international incident based on nothing more substantial than a misunderstood radio transmission. The political implications were staggering. Questions would be asked in Parliament about the effectiveness of royal protection protocols. The media would demand explanations for what appeared to be a massive overreaction to a non-existent threat. Other royal family members would need to be briefed on what had happened and why their own security arrangements might need to be reviewed. But for Marcus, sitting in the safe room with a man he'd protected for 23 years, the implications were much more personal and immediate. He'd just violated the first principle of protection work. Never create unnecessary drama or disruption in the life of the person you're sworn to protect. He'd put the prince through a frightening and potentially dangerous situation based on his own compromised judgment. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "I believe I should request immediate medical attention and relief from duty." "Yes," the prince replied. "I believe you should." It was the last conversation they would ever have as protection officer and charge. The emergency response teams that had converged on St. James's Palace were stood down at 6:47 p.m., exactly 2 hours and 12 minutes after Marcus had initiated the lockdown. The prince was escorted to his private residence by a replacement protection detail, his demeanor calm and professional despite having spent the afternoon in a reinforced safe room due to a non-existent threat. He made no public statements about the incident, offered no criticism of the protection officer who had potentially ruined his own career in a moment of medical crisis. Marcus was taken directly to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, where emergency physicians conducted a battery of tests to determine what had caused his dramatic loss of situational awareness. The initial examination revealed elevated blood pressure, irregular heart rhythm, and signs of severe exhaustion that suggested he'd been operating on pure adrenaline for weeks without adequate rest. But it would be the MRI scan performed 6 hours later that provided the real answer: a small but significant stroke in the area of his brain responsible for processing spatial awareness and threat assessment. Dr. Sarah Chun, the neurologist who reviewed Marcus's scans, explained it to him in terms that highlighted just how close he'd come to complete disaster. The stroke was minor by medical standards, but it occurred in precisely the worst possible location for someone in your profession. Your ability to distinguish between real and perceived threats was temporarily compromised, along with your spatial orientation and short-term memory processing. Frankly, Mr. Whitfield, you're fortunate that you didn't collapse entirely. "How long?" Marcus asked from his hospital bed, still trying to process the reality that his body had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. "How long what? How long has this been building?" "The symptoms, I mean. There were signs, weren't there? Things I should have noticed." Dr. Chun consulted his chart, noting the minor tremors he'd mentioned, the occasional dizziness, the moments of confusion he'd dismissed as simple fatigue. "Possibly several weeks. The warning signs of this type of stroke can be subtle, especially in someone accustomed to working through physical discomfort. You likely attributed the early symptoms to job stress or lack of sleep." "Several weeks," Marcus repeated. The timeline meant that he'd been operating with compromised judgment during multiple protection assignments, putting not just the prince, but potentially other royal family members at risk without even realizing it. The thought made him physically ill. "Mr. Whitfield, I need to stress that this was not something you could have predicted or prevented through willpower or professional dedication. This was a medical emergency that would have incapacitated anyone, regardless of their training or experience." But Marcus wasn't listening to medical explanations. He was thinking about 23 years of perfect service records, of a reputation for reliability that had made him the most trusted protection officer in the royal security detail. All of that was now overshadowed by 2 hours of spectacular failure that would define the rest of his career. However, much of it remained. The internal investigation began the following morning. Marcus was placed on administrative leave while a review board examined every aspect of the incident, from the initial trigger of his response to the decision-making process that had led to a full palace lockdown. The investigation would eventually span 3 weeks and involve interviews with dozens of palace staff members, security personnel, and government officials. Chief Inspector Davidson visited Marcus in the hospital 2 days after the incident, his expression carefully neutral as he delivered news that wasn't entirely unexpected, but was still devastating to hear. The preliminary findings indicate no criminal negligence or intentional misconduct, Davidson began, settling into the visitor's chair beside Marcus's bed. The medical evidence supports your claim that you were experiencing a significant health emergency that impaired your judgment. However, the damage is done. Marcus finished. "The prince has personally requested that no disciplinary action be taken against you. He's made it clear to everyone involved that he considers your years of exemplary service more important than one medical incident. But, Marcus, you have to understand the position this puts everyone in. Questions are being asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary wants a complete review of royal protection protocols. There are suggestions that the entire security detail needs psychological evaluation and mandatory health screening." Marcus stared at the hospital ceiling, trying to imagine what his colleagues must be thinking. Some would be sympathetic, understanding that anyone could experience a medical emergency. Others would be angry that his mistake had brought unwanted scrutiny to their professional competence. All of them would now be subject to additional oversight and evaluation because of his one moment of catastrophic failure. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Medical retirement, if you want it. Full pension, recognition of your service record, official acknowledgement that this was a health-related incident rather than professional incompetence. The prince specifically requested that your service awards and commendations remain part of your official record. And if I don't want medical retirement?" Davidson's expression softened slightly. "Marcus, you had a stroke. A minor one, but still a stroke. The doctors are saying full recovery is likely, but there will always be questions about whether it could happen again. More importantly, after what happened Tuesday, you'll never again have the complete trust that's essential for close protection work. Every decision you make will be second-guessed, every threat assessment questioned. That's not fair to you, and it's not safe for whoever you're assigned to protect." The truth of Davidson's words settled into Marcus's chest like a weight. Trust was the foundation of protection work, and trust, once broken, could rarely be fully repaired. Even if he recovered completely from the stroke, even if he passed every medical and psychological evaluation, there would always be the memory of that Tuesday afternoon when his judgment had catastrophically failed. "How much time do I have to decide?" "As much as you need. But, Marcus, there's something else you should know. The prince has asked to see you before you make any final decisions about your future." The meeting was arranged for the following Friday at Highgrove House, the prince's private residence in Gloucestershire. Marcus made the journey by train, no longer accompanied by the security details and official vehicles that had been part of his daily routine for more than 2 decades. The transition to civilian travel felt strange and somehow diminished, like learning to walk again after years of muscle memory. He was met at the house by Inspector James Hartwell, who had taken over as the prince's primary protection officer. Hartwell was younger than Marcus, highly competent, but still learning the subtle rhythms and preferences that made close protection work truly effective. The handover briefing had been thorough, but necessarily incomplete. Some aspects of the job could only be learned through years of observation and experience. "How is he?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the house. "Professional as always. He's asked specifically that this meeting be conducted without security present, which you can imagine makes me uncomfortable. But he was insistent that you two should have privacy for this conversation." The prince was waiting in his private study, dressed casually in a way that Marcus had seen thousands of times, but that now seemed strangely formal given the circumstances. He stood when Marcus entered, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged their changed relationship while maintaining appropriate dignity for both of them. "Marcus, you're looking better than when I last saw you." "Thank you, sir. I'm feeling much improved." They sat in chairs positioned near the window overlooking the prince's beloved gardens, a setting that was both intimate and careful about maintaining appropriate boundaries. The prince had clearly thought about how to conduct this conversation in a way that would be meaningful without being inappropriate. "I wanted to see you before you made any decisions about your future," the prince began, "because I felt there were things that needed to be said directly, without the filter of official channels or administrative procedures." Marcus nodded, unsure of what response was appropriate. "First, I want you to understand that I harbor no resentment or ill will regarding what happened last Tuesday. You suffered a medical emergency while performing your duties, and you handled it as well as anyone could under those circumstances. The fact that you recognized something was wrong and Requested relief shows exactly the kind of professional judgment that has made you such an exceptional protection officer. Sir, I put you through an extremely difficult and potentially dangerous situation based on my compromised judgment. That's not professional behavior by any reasonable standard. Marcus, in 23 years, you have never once prioritized your own comfort or convenience over my safety. You have missed family gatherings, canceled holidays, and sacrificed personal relationships to ensure that I could carry out my duties without fear or concern. Last Tuesday, you erred on the side of caution when you weren't certain about a potential threat. That strikes me as entirely consistent with the dedication you've shown throughout your career. The prince paused, looking out at his gardens where autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and bronze. I've been thinking a great deal about the nature of our relationship over these past 2 decades. It's unlike any other professional association in my life, and I suspect it's been unlike anything in yours as well. You've been present for some of my most private moments, have seen me at my worst, and hopefully my best, have been a constant presence through enormous changes in my personal and public life. Marcus felt a knot forming in his throat. This conversation was heading toward a goodbye that he wasn't emotionally prepared for, despite having known it was inevitable. What I want you to understand is that your service has meant more to me than simple protection. You've been a steady presence in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Your professionalism has allowed me to focus on my duties without constantly worrying about my safety or the safety of those around me. That's a gift that can't be measured in official commendations or service records. Sir, it's been the honor of my life to serve in this capacity. I know it has, and that's exactly why this next part is so difficult. The prince stood and walked to his desk, returning with an envelope that bore the royal seal. This is my personal recommendation for your medical retirement, along with a letter that will become part of your permanent service record. I've detailed not just your professional competence, but your character, your dedication, and your irreplaceable contribution to the security and well-being of this family. Marcus accepted the envelope, understanding that this was both recognition and farewell. There's one more thing, the prince continued. I've spoken with several private security firms that handle executive protection for international corporations and high-profile individuals. If you choose to continue working in some capacity after your full recovery, I provided references that should open doors to opportunities that would make good use of your experience without the same level of scrutiny and stress that comes with royal protection. Thank you, sir. That's more generous than I expected. Marcus, you've given me 23 years of your life. The least I can do is help ensure that whatever comes next is something that honors that service appropriately. They talked for another 20 minutes about practical matters, the transition to Inspector Hartwell, changes in security protocols that have been implemented since Tuesday's incident, the ongoing parliamentary inquiry that would likely result in new oversight procedures for royal protection officers. It was a conversation between professionals who had shared an extraordinary working relationship, conducted with the respect and dignity that both men had earned. As Marcus prepared to leave, the prince made one final observation that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Marcus, I think Tuesday afternoon taught me something important about trust and human fallibility. For 23 years, I've relied on your perfect judgment and flawless performance. That kind of perfection was never sustainable, and perhaps it wasn't healthy for either of us. What happened Tuesday was frightening, but it was also deeply human. It reminded me that even the most dedicated professionals are still human beings, subject to all the limitations and vulnerabilities that entails. I'm not sure I understand, sir. I think what I'm saying is that your one moment of human failure doesn't diminish 23 years of exceptional service. It simply makes both more real, more meaningful. Perfect records belong in books, Marcus. Real service, real dedication, real loyalty. Those things are messy and complicated and occasionally heartbreaking. And occasionally catastrophic. Yes, but also occasionally beautiful. As Marcus walked away from Highgrove House for the final time, he carried with him the weight of an ended career and the unexpected gift of his former charge's grace and understanding. The mistake that had destroyed his professional life had also revealed something profound about the nature of the relationship he'd spent more than 2 decades building and maintaining. The story of Detective Inspector Marcus Whitfield's service to the Crown was ending, but it was ending with dignity intact and honor acknowledged, despite one shocking afternoon when everything went wrong. 6 months after the incident at St. James's Palace, Marcus Whitfield stood in the arrivals hall at Heathrow Airport, holding a sign with the name Dr. Elena Vasquez written in neat block letters. It was his first day working for Meridian Executive Protection, one of the private security firms the prince had recommended, and his first assignment was protecting a Colombian pharmaceutical executive who had received death threats related to her company's anti-malaria research. The transition from royal protection to private security had been more difficult than Marcus had anticipated. The work was similar in many technical respects, but the rhythm and culture were completely different. Private clients were often demanding in ways that royalty never was, expecting their protection officers to also serve as personal assistants, drivers, and sometimes confidants for problems that had nothing to do with security. There was less prestige, but more money, less tradition, but more flexibility, less honor, but also less scrutiny. Dr. Vasquez emerged from customs precisely on time, a compact woman in her 40s with the alert eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities quickly. She spotted Marcus immediately, something that told him she'd been well briefed on personal security protocols. "Mr. Whitfield? Emelena Vasquez. Doctor, welcome to London. I trust your flight was comfortable as 12 hours in economy can be. I understand you come highly recommended." They walked toward the exit, Marcus automatically scanning the crowd and calculating routes while maintaining conversation. The skills were still there, muscle memory intact, but he felt like a musician playing a familiar song in a different key. Everything was recognizable, but slightly off. "May I ask about the nature of the threats you've received?" Marcus said as they reached the waiting car. "Death threats, primarily. My company developed a new anti-malaria drug that significantly undercuts the price of existing treatments. Certain pharmaceutical interests are not pleased with our market disruption. There have also been threats from local criminal organizations in Colombia who apparently profit from black market medical supplies." Marcus processed this information while conducting a visual sweep of the parking structure. Private sector threats were often more complex and unpredictable than the ideological or political threats he'd dealt with in royal protection. Business disputes could generate violence from multiple directions, making threat assessment more challenging. "Have you worked royal protection before?" Dr. Vasquez asked as they settled into the back seat of the armored sedan. 23 years with the Metropolitan Police, most recently as personal protection officer for the Prince of Wales. "Most recently? You're quite young to be retired from such a prestigious position." Marcus had prepared for this question, knowing it would come up frequently in his new career. "Medical retirement. I had a stroke while on duty. Minor, but enough to end my career in close royal protection." Dr. Vasquez studied his face with the analytical expression of someone trained in scientific observation. "You seem to have recovered well. Complete recovery, according to my doctors. But royal protection requires absolute certainty about an officer's health and judgment. Even the possibility of recurrence makes you unsuitable for that level of responsibility. Their loss is my gain, I suppose. Though I imagine the adjustment must be difficult." The comment was perceptive enough to make Marcus wonder how much Dr. Vasquez had been told about his background. Meridian Executive Protection was discreet about their personnel files, but some clients insisted on detailed briefings about their assigned officers. The safe house where Dr. Vasquez would be staying during her London visit was a converted Georgian townhouse in Belgravia, selected for its defensive advantages and proximity to the medical conferences she would be attending. Marcus conducted a security sweep while she settled into her accommodations, noting the sight lines, escape routes, and potential vulnerability points that would shape their security protocols for the next week. It was professional work, competently executed, but it felt hollow in a way that surprised him. For 23 years, his protection work had carried a weight of history and tradition that made even routine assignments feel significant. Protecting Dr. Vasquez was important and potentially dangerous, but it was also fundamentally commercial. She was paying for safety, and he was providing a service with none of the deeper meaning that had made royal protection feel like a calling. That evening, as Dr. Vasquez prepared for a dinner meeting with British medical researchers, Marcus found himself thinking about Inspector Hartwell and wondering how his replacement was adapting to the unique pressures of royal protection. The thought led inevitably to memories of the prince, and Marcus realized with some surprise that he missed not just the job, but the person he'd spent more than 2 decades protecting. It wasn't appropriate to miss a former charge. Professional boundaries were supposed to prevent that kind of emotional attachment. But sitting in the security office of a Belgravia safe house, monitoring camera feeds and radio chatter, Marcus acknowledged that his relationship with the prince had been more complex than simple professional duty. He genuinely cared about the man's well-being in ways that went beyond contractual obligation. The medical conference that Dr. Vasquez was attending proved to be a more complex security challenge than initially anticipated. Her anti-malaria research had attracted attention from multiple groups with conflicting interests. Pharmaceutical companies worried about market disruption, humanitarian organizations excited about affordable treatment options, and criminal networks concerned about losing profitable black market territories. Each group represented different types of potential threats that required different security approaches. On the second day of the conference, Marcus identified what appeared to be surveillance by at least 2 different teams. One group seemed professional, possibly corporate intelligence, gathering information for legal challenges to Dr. Vasquez's patents. The other group was less sophisticated but potentially more dangerous, showing the characteristics of criminal organization operatives who might be planning something more direct than legal action. Dr. Marcus said during a brief break between conference sessions, "I'm recommending that we modify your schedule for the remainder of your visit. There are indications that your presence here is drawing more attention than initially anticipated." What kind of attention? Multiple surveillance teams, possibly representing different interests. Nothing immediately threatening, but the situation is more complex than our initial threat assessment suggested. Dr. Vasquez considered this information with the same analytical approach she'd shown since their first meeting. "Mr. Whitfield, may I ask you something directly?" "Of course. Are you treating me differently because I'm a private client rather than royalty? Is your threat assessment more conservative or less conservative than it would be for someone with a hereditary title?" The question caught Marcus off guard, partly because it was perceptive and partly because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "I don't believe so. My protocols are the same regardless of the client status." "But the stakes feel different, don't they?" Marcus found himself staring at Dr. Vasquez with something approaching respect. She was asking him to examine his own professional motivations in a way that most clients would never think to do. "Yes," he admitted, "the stakes do feel different. Not because your life is less valuable, but because the consequences of failure are less public. When I was protecting the prince, failure would have had national and international implications. With you, failure would be personal and professional, but not historical. And does that make you more cautious or less cautious?" "I honestly don't know. I'm still learning how to adjust my mindset to private sector work." Dr. Vasquez smiled for the first time since Marcus had met her. "Mr. Whitfield, I think you may be overthinking this. I hired you because you're exceptionally good at keeping people alive. Whether those people happen to be royal or simply important to pharmaceutical research seems irrelevant to that core competency." That evening, Marcus implemented enhanced security protocols based on his surveillance observations. Additional electronic countermeasures, modified transportation routes, and coordination with local police units that were monitoring the medical conference. It was complex work that required the same skills and attention to detail that royal protection had demanded. But as the week progressed, Marcus began to recognize something that Dr. Vasquez had identified more quickly than he had. The work itself hadn't changed, only the context. threat assessment, route planning, emergency protocols, communication security. All the technical aspects of protection work remained exactly the same whether the client was royal or civilian. On Dr. Vasquez's final evening in London, one of the surveillance teams made their move. Marcus had anticipated some kind of approach based on their behavior patterns, but the actual incident still required split-second decision-making and precise execution of emergency protocols. The team attempted a vehicle intercept as Marcus and Dr. Vasquez were leaving the conference center. Two cars, coordinated timing, designed to box in their sedan and force it to stop. It was professional enough to be dangerous, but not sophisticated enough to account for Marcus's experience with evasive driving techniques learned during anti-terrorism training. Marcus executed a reverse J-turn that put their vehicle behind the intercept cars, then took an alternate route that he'd scouted earlier in the week. Within 4 minutes, they were at the safe house, where additional security personnel were waiting. The attempted intercept had failed completely, and Dr. Vasquez had never been in actual danger. "That was impressive," she said as they reached the safety of the townhouse. "Standard evasion protocols. Nothing unusual. Mr. Whitfield, may I make an observation?" "Please. You just performed exactly the same kind of split-second decision-making and flawless execution that I imagine you provided during your royal protection career. The skills that made you exceptional at that job are exactly the skills that make you exceptional at this job. Whatever medical incident ended your royal career, it clearly didn't affect your professional competence." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you, Doctor. That means more than you might realize. I think I understand exactly what it means. You've been questioning whether you're still the same professional you were before your stroke. Tonight proved that you are." The assignment concluded without further incident, and Dr. Vasquez returned to Colombia with enhanced security recommendations for her ongoing research work. Marcus's performance report from Meridian Executive Protection was flawless, and he was immediately assigned to another high-profile client. But more importantly, he'd rediscovered something that he'd lost in the aftermath of his catastrophic mistake at St. James's Palace: confidence in his professional judgment and competence. The stroke had ended his royal protection career, but it hadn't destroyed his ability to keep people safe. 3 weeks later, Marcus received a phone call that surprised him more than any threat assessment or security challenge he'd faced in his new career. "Mr. Whitfield, this is Inspector Hartwell from the Metropolitan Police Royal Protection Unit." "Inspector, how can I help you?" "I'm calling on behalf of His Royal Highness. The Prince would like to know if you might be interested in serving as a security consultant for some of his charitable activities. Private capacity, not official royal protection, but work that would involve some of the international travel and threat assessment skills you developed during your service." Marcus sat in his new office at Meridian Executive Protection, looking out a London street that suddenly seemed full of interesting possibilities. "What kind of consulting work?" "His Royal Highness has been invited to visit several countries where security conditions are challenging. Colombia, for instance, where he'll be meeting with pharmaceutical researchers about malaria prevention programs. The Royal Protection Unit would handle official security, but His Royal Highness specifically requested additional consultation from someone with recent private sector experience in those regions." Marcus smiled, understanding immediately that the prince had been briefed on his successful assignment protecting Dr. Vasquez. "Inspector, please tell His Royal Highness that I would be honored to provide whatever assistance I can." "Excellent. There's one more thing, Mr. Whitfield." "Yes." "His Royal Highness asked me to tell you that he's been following your career with great interest and considerable pride. He wanted you to know that your service to the Crown continues in ways that may be different, but are no less valuable." After the call ended, Marcus sat quietly in his office, thinking about the strange turns that life could take. A catastrophic mistake had ended one career, but had led to another that was proving to be more fulfilling than he'd expected. The skills and dedication that had served him in royal protection were now serving him in private security, and, apparently, they might serve the Crown again in a different capacity. He thought about Dr. Vasquez's observation that his professional competence hadn't been affected by his medical incident. only his career trajectory. He thought about the prince's message that his service to the crown was continuing in different ways. Most of all, he thought about the fact that protecting people, whether they were royal or simply important, remained meaningful work that used every skill and instinct he developed over 25 years of professional life. Marcus Whitfield's career as the Prince of Wales's personal protection officer had ended in spectacular fashion due to one shocking mistake. But his career as someone who kept important people safe was just beginning a new and unexpected chapter. The mistake that had destroyed everything had also, in its own way, set him free to discover that his value as a protector went far beyond any single assignment or position. He was still the same man who had dedicated his life to keeping others safe. He was just doing it in a different context, with different challenges, and perhaps most importantly, with a deeper understanding of his own humanity and fallibility. Sometimes the most devastating failures lead to the most unexpected opportunities for growth and renewal. Marcus Whitfield's shocking mistake had cost him the position of a lifetime, but it had also taught him that his worth as a professional and as a person wasn't defined by one perfect record or one catastrophic failure. It was defined by what he chose to do next.